Imagine stepping off the stage of a Mr. Universe bodybuilding competition. You are, by every conventional outward metric, in the absolute peak physical condition a human being can possibly achieve.
Right. You're looking at single-digit body fat, totally optimized.
Exactly. Your body fat is completely stripped away. The musculature is perfect. You are the literal picture of aesthetic health. But then, over the next 11 weeks, without changing your fundamental approach, you just inexplicably gain 42 pounds of fat and water.
Which, I mean, sounds completely impossible.
Yeah. Your diet didn't change drastically. Your discipline didn't just evaporate, but your internal biological matrix just completely collapsed.
Yeah, and that scenario, it sounds like science fiction to most people, or maybe they think it's the result of some massive secret binge. But it's actually a documented physiological reality when we completely misunderstand how the human body processes stress. We've been so conditioned to view health through this highly compartmentalized lens, We treat the human body like it's a collection of isolated parts just sitting on a mechanic's workbench.
Totally. It's like, oh, you have a leaky tire, so you patch the tire. Your heart has an issue, so you go to the heart mechanic. Your brain feels foggy, you go to the brain mechanic. We just want these clean borders, right? Treat this part, ignore the rest.
And that's exactly the problem.
Well, welcome to this deep dive. For you listening right now, especially if you're that specific type of learner who just loves connecting the dots, who wants the absolute best, most cutting-edge information, but you completely hate the overwhelming, contradictory noise of modern health advice, you have basically found your gold mine today.
Absolutely. Because the material we're analyzing today, it fundamentally rejects that mechanic's workbench approach. I think the most fascinating aspect of these combined sources is how they just systematically shatter decades of entrenched medical and fitness dogmas.
Yeah, they really do.
They force us to zoom out. When you actually analyze the clinical data, you quickly realize that you cannot optimize the heart without addressing the muscles. And you can't fix the gut without addressing your psychological state.
Right, or protect the brain without localized hormones.
Yeah.
We are looking at the ultimate interconnected operating manual for human vitality. Today's sources prove that longevity, it isn't about treating separate parts of the body. It's about understanding the entire biological matrix. So, okay, let's unpack this, because to truly understand this interconnected matrix, we really need to start with the physical engine itself, right? How we move.
Yeah, movement is the baseline.
And if there is one thing our sources make crystal clear right out of gate, it's that almost everything the general public has been taught about cardiovascular training and metabolism and aging is just entirely backwards.
It really is. We're operating on this massively outdated paradigm that basically equates repetitive chronic motion with metabolic health. The sources we have demand a complete redefinition of what movement means for longevity. We have to move away from this idea of chronic output and move toward strategic biological signaling.
Let's ground this in the real world with fitness expert J.J. Virgin, because her personal experiment, which is detailed in the sources, is going to resonate so deeply with anyone who has spent just countless grueling hours on a treadmill or an elliptical machine hoping to, outrun their metabolism.
Oh, the chronic cardio track.
Exactly. In her 20s, she was doing everything, quote unquote, right, according to the standard, unquestioned advice of that era. She was a low-fat, vegan endurance athlete. She was putting in massive miles, keeping her dietary fat intake virtually non-existent.
Just strict calories in, calories out dogma.
Right. And the expectation under that model is that she should have been extraordinarily lean and just metabolically invincible.
But the result was the exact opposite.
Her body fat rose to 25%. I read that and had to just pause, because it's like running a car's engine so hot for so long that it literally starts melting its own parts. It defies the basic physics we're taught in high school health class. I mean, how does someone burning thousands of calories a week in chronic endurance training gain that much body fat?
Well, we have to look past the simple math of calorie burning, right? We have to examine the underlying chemistry of the body's stress response. Chronic endurance training isn't just a mechanical process where you're expending energy. It's actually a profound chemical signal.
A stress signal.
Exactly. When you run for hours on end, you're sending a sustained high-level stress signal directly to your endocrine system. And your body responds to that perceived threat by dramatically elevating your cortisol levels.
And cortisol is our primary stress hormone. I mean, we need it to wake up in the morning or to escape immediate danger.
Right. In an acute burst, cortisol is highly adaptive. It mobilizes glucose so you can run from a predator. But chronically elevated cortisol, which is exactly what happens when you subject yourself to endless daily endurance slogging that becomes highly catabolic.
And catabolic basically means it breaks tissue down, right?
Yes. Your body gets so desperate for immediate energy to sustain this chronic stress that it literally starts breaking down your own lean muscle tissue. It converts those amino acids into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis.
Wow. So she wasn't just burning calories, she was actively consuming her own muscle mass to fuel the chronic cardio.
Yeah, and that leads to the really critical metabolic consequence. When you break down that muscle tissue, you are actively lowering your resting metabolic rate. Muscle is highly metabolically active tissue. It requires a massive amount of energy just to exist on your frame.
I really want to highlight the specific data the sources bring up here because it puts a definitive number to this concept. There's this fascinating clinical study involving a 100-day overfeeding protocol.
Oh, that study is a cornerstone in understanding human metabolism.
It's wild. Researchers essentially locked subjects in a metabolic ward and forced them to consume a massive caloric surplus for over 3 months, 100 straight days of overeating.
They wanted to see what the human body actually does with that excess energy when all the other variables are completely controlled.
Right. And the findings proved that lean skeletal muscle mass, not your total body weight, and certainly not your fat mass, is the single strongest independent predictor of your resting metabolic rate.
It dictates the actual size of your metabolic furnace. If you possess a large amount of lean skeletal muscle, your body is incredibly efficient at partitioning excess calories. It uses them for repair, for heat generation, for maintaining that tissue.
But if you've spent years degrading your muscle mass through chronic cardio and those elevated cortisol levels,
Then your furnace shrinks. You can be eating very few calories, but because your metabolic rate has plummeted alongside your muscle mass, your body just stores whatever it can as fat. It's a survival mechanism. And that is exactly what happened to JJ Virgin.
by trying to burn calories through endless cardio, she was shrinking the very engine that burns calories naturally while she was just sitting around resting. So what is the corrective mechanism here? Because the solution to muscle loss and metabolic slowdown obviously isn't spending more hours on the track.
No, definitely not. The sources outline a major pivot toward high-intensity interval training, or HIIT, and specifically they recommend sessions that last only 10 to 20 minutes.
Which, sounds suspiciously easy to someone who is conditioned to run for 2 hours.
Yeah.
How does 10 minutes replace an hour of cardio?
Because you're fundamentally changing the biological signal. The goal of a 10-minute HIIT session isn't to see how many calories you can burn on a digital readout in that specific moment. The goal is to stimulate a biological adaptation known as mitochondrial biogenesis.
Mitochondria being the powerhouses of the cells,
Yeah.
the structures that actually turn the fuel we eat into usable cellular energy.
Yeah, exactly. When you engage in short, intense bursts of effort, you create a massive but temporary energy demand. This brief, intense signal forces your cells to literally build new mitochondria, and it makes the existing ones more efficient.
You're upgrading the machinery.
You're upgrading the cellular machinery. And crucially, because the session is only 10 to 20 minutes long, you stimulate this adaptation without subjecting the body to the chronic oxidative stress and the sustained cortisol spikes that break down muscle. You get the upgraded engine without the catabolic melting.
That is so key. So muscle is the ultimate metabolic regulator. It's the furnace. But the sources don't stop there. And this is where the interconnected nature of the human body really starts to reveal itself. Because muscle doesn't just manage your waistline or your resting heart rate. Muscle actively protects the physical structure of your brain.
And this represents one of the most profound paradigm shifts in modern longevity science. We are finally moving away from viewing the brain and the bicep as entirely separate domains.
Let's dive into the work of research scientist Sean Stevenson here. He highlighted an incredibly revealing 10-year clinical study. And what makes this study so robust is that it specifically looked at healthy female twins.
Yeah, studying identical twins is basically the gold standard for observational research. It inherently controls for the vast majority of genetic variables. So if one twin develops a condition and the other doesn't, you can be highly confident that you're looking at the result of lifestyle factors and environmental inputs rather than some predetermined genetic destiny.
Right, so they tracked these twins for an entire decade, same genetic blueprint, but their lifestyles differed. And the researchers found that the twin who possessed greater leg power, specifically raw lower body strength, experienced significantly less cognitive decline over that 10-year period.
And it wasn't just cognitive tests on a piece of paper either.
No. 12 years later, They ran actual brain scans, and the twin with stronger legs physically possessed greater gray matter volume in her brain.
Which is incredible. We traditionally think of the brain as this isolated, centralized command center, right? Like it simply sends electrical signals down the spinal cord to tell the muscles to contract. This study totally flips that hierarchy. It proves the signaling is a two-way street.
It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. The sheer physical demand of maintaining the body's largest muscle groups, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the glutes, that sends continuous systemic chemical signals back up to the brain.
What kind of signals? Like, how does a strong quad literally build brain tissue?
Well, when you heavily recruit large muscle fibers, they actually act as an endocrine organ. They secrete compounds often referred to as myokines, and these myokines travel through the bloodstream and they cross the blood-brain barrier.
Wow.
Yeah, and they stimulate the release of factors like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which acts like fertilizer for the brain. It promotes the survival of existing neurons and encourages the growth of new synapses. So the physical load on the legs is literally chemically demanding that the brain preserve its architecture.
That is wild. And the mortality statistics connected to this are just staggering. Stevenson points to another clinical data set demonstrating that for every 10% increase in quadriceps strength relative to a person's body weight, their risk of premature death drops by 23%.
I mean, a 10% increase in strength yielding a 23% reduction in all-cause mortality. That is a return on investment that no pharmaceutical drug on the market can even begin to approach.
I look at this like depositing money into a neurological 401k. Every time you're doing a heavy squat or a hip hinge, or even just sitting against a wall doing an isometric wall sit, which Stevenson points out is highly effective, you aren't just trying to make your legs look better for the summer. You are actively compounding structural, chemical protection for your brain a decade from now.
It's a systemic investment. The muscle is the shield for the neurology.
Now, I know someone listening to this right now is looking at their schedule. They're hearing HIIT sessions and heavy squats, and they're thinking, look, I have a demanding corporate job. I have 3 kids. I have a commute. I simply do not have the time or the energy for massive structured gym sessions to build this muscle.
And that is the most common and honestly entirely valid barrier to entry. And it's exactly why the work of Dr. Rhonda Patrick, as highlighted in the source material, is so vital here. She brings forward research proving that you absolutely do not need an hour-long structured gym session to trigger these massive, life-altering longevity benefits.
Right. She focuses heavily on this concept called VLPA, vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity.
Yeah, VLPA is the ultimate antidote to the "I don't have time" argument. It's all about seamlessly integrating microbursts of vigorous effort into the normal fabric of your daily routine. And the clinical studies she cites regarding VLPA are nothing short of revolutionary. We are talking about engaging in just 3 minutes of vigorous activity 3 times a day.
9 total minutes.
9 minutes of elevated effort spread across a 16-hour waking day. And the data shows that this minimal investment is associated with a 40% reduction in cancer-related mortality and a massive 50% reduction in cardiovascular mortality.
I really have to pause on that. Your statistical risk of dying from a cardiovascular event is cut in half by doing what amounts to 9 minutes of heavy breathing throughout the day. I mean, how is a stimulus that small creating a systemic effect that large?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it makes perfect evolutionary sense. The human biological matrix, it just didn't evolve to jog on a flat rubber treadmill for 45 minutes at a perfectly moderate, steady state. We evolved for intermittent bursts of absolute maximum effort, followed by periods of rest.
Like sprinting away from a predator.
Exactly. Sprinting from a predator, carrying a heavy carcass back to camp, rapidly climbing a tree to escape danger.
So the body is completely wired to respond to sudden, extreme demands.
Yes. When you engage in VLPAC, whether that's sprinting up 3 flights of stairs in your office building or carrying heavy grocery bags from the far end of the parking lot at a brisk pace, you are sending an acute survival signal to your entire system. You spike the heart rate, you cause rapid shear stress on the blood vessels, which promotes elasticity, and you demand immediate metabolic adaptation.
You're waking the body up.
Right. The body wakes up all of its cellular defense mechanisms because it perceives a sudden environmental demand.
Dr. Patrick details a specific study about blood glucose that illustrates this microdosing of exercise perfectly too. They compared two approaches to regulating blood sugar during a completely sedentary workday. And they found that a person doing just 10 bodyweight squats every 45 minutes while working at their desk regulated their blood glucose levels significantly better than a person who sat all day and then went for a continuous 30-minute walk at the very end of the day.
And that's because of the way muscles uptake glucose. When you sit for 8 hours, the glucose from your meals just circulates in your bloodstream, and eventually that causes endothelial damage and prompts massive insulin spikes.
Right.
But when you do 10 squats, the mechanical contraction of the leg muscles physically forces the muscle cells to open their doors, specifically the GLUT4 transporters, and pull glucose out of the blood without even needing insulin to do it. So by doing this every 45 minutes, you're constantly clearing the bloodstream of excess sugar.
You're treating the muscle like a sponge, and you're wringing it out consistently throughout the day, rather than just letting the water pool on the floor for 8 hours.
That's a perfect biological analogy. Frequent, potent signals to the system always outperform chronic, moderate slogs.
Okay, so we've established that movement is the engine, and that muscle is the regulator, the protector of the brain. But movement is really only half the metabolic equation. If muscle is the engine, what happens when we completely change the primary fuel source we put into that engine?
This is where we transition from how we expend energy to what we actually consume. And just like with cardiovascular training, the clinical data completely upends the deeply ingrained dogmas about nutrition, particularly our heavy societal reliance on carbohydrates for energy.
Let's bring in the work of Dr. Andrew Ketogenic here. He has this incredible personal background. He managed to reverse his own childhood obesity, and he actively manages his type 1 diabetes, primarily by adopting a higher protein ketogenic diet. But it's his clinical research that really flips the script on what the human engine is capable of.
Yeah, Dr. Kautnik has been conducting deeply controlled clinical studies on middle-aged endurance athletes and Ironman competitors. These are individuals who have been indoctrinated for their entire athletic lives to believe that massive amounts of carbohydrates are the only viable fuel source for high-level human performance.
Oh, it's the classic 1990s food pyramid logic applied to sports. You have to carb load the night before the marathon. You eat the massive bowl of pasta, and you suck down those sugary gel packets every 4 miles during the race so you don't hit the infamous wall where your body just shuts down. The assumption is that an endurance athlete cannot possibly perform without a constant drip of glucose.
And that assumption is exactly what Kautnik decided to test in a rigorous clinical setting. He took these elite, carbohydrate-dependent athletes and put them through a specialized 4 to 6 week period of strict fat adaptation on a low-carbohydrate, higher-protein ketogenic diet.
So he essentially starved their bodies of their primary preferred fuel source for a month and a half while they continued to train.
Exactly. He removed the exogenous glucose to force their cellular machinery to adapt. And the biological shift that occurred after those 4 to 6 weeks is truly groundbreaking. When tested, these subjects experienced absolutely zero drop in their athletic performance.
None at all.
None. Their power output remained stable. They maintained optimal brain energy metabolism, completely avoiding the brain fog that's usually associated with blood sugar crashes. And most impressively, from a physiological standpoint, they hit the highest rates of fat oxidation ever recorded in scientific literature.
Wow. What were the actual numbers on that oxidation?
They were actively oxidizing over 1.5 grams of fat per minute during sustained exercise.
Let's contextualize that, because 1.5 grams of fat per minute might just sound like a random statistic to someone listening. Why is that specific rate of fat burning so biologically significant for an athlete?
It signifies that the athlete has successfully tapped into a virtually limitless reservoir of energy, entirely bypassing the biological bottleneck that causes people to hit the wall. Let's look at the anatomy of fuel storage for a second. When your body relies on carbohydrates, it stores that energy as glycogen in the liver and in the muscle tissue. But that storage capacity is incredibly limited. An average athlete might only be able to store a couple of thousand calories worth of glycogen.
Which you can easily burn through in the first 2 hours of a marathon.
Exactly. And when that glycogen tank runs dry, your brain senses a catastrophic fuel shortage. It sends signals to shut down muscle recruitment. You feel exhausted, your legs feel like lead, and you physically crash. That is the wall. However, even a highly conditioned single-digit body fat athlete carries tens of thousands of calories stored as adipose tissue body fat.
So by adapting the body through this specific 4 to 6 week dietary protocol, Kautnik proved you can essentially rewire the human engine to ignore the tiny, limited primary fuel tank and instead runs seamlessly on the massive auxiliary fuel tank that it usually struggles to access during high-intensity output.
Precisely. By combining the production of ketones, which are highly efficient fuel molecules produced by the liver when carbohydrates are absent, with adequate protein intake to preserve lean mass, the body proves it can run effortlessly on this alternative fuel. It provides limitless energy without the constant spikes, crashes, and localized inflammation of carbohydrate dependency.
But the source material also reveals that it's not just what fuel you put into the engine, it's also when you completely stop fueling it. Dr. Rhonda Patrick brings up a crucial, often ignored point about meal timing.
Yeah, meal timing is a massive lever for systemic longevity that gets completely overshadowed by the constant debates over which macronutrient is best.
She cites a recent clinical study that utilized continuous 24-hour blood pressure monitoring. And the researchers found a very specific correlation regarding evening habits. They discovered that if you simply halt your food intake 3 hours before you go to sleep, your blood pressure is able to dip significantly lower overnight compared to people who eat closer to bedtime.
The mechanism here is rooted in our autonomic nervous system. Digestion is an incredibly demanding metabolic process. It requires massive blood flow to the splanchnic circulation of the gut, and it requires significant energy expenditure to break down, absorb, and assimilate nutrients. If you consume a meal right before bed, your entire gastrointestinal system is basically working the night shift.
Your conscious brain might be asleep, but your internal organs are running a marathon.
Yes, your heart rate remains elevated to pump that blood to the gut, and your core body temperature stays high. Because of this, your blood pressure doesn't get the biological permission to plummet into the deep, restorative trough that is supposed to happen during the deepest phases of sleep. By implementing that strict 3-hour fasting buffer before bed, you give the digestive process time to clear.
And that lets the nervous system relax.
Exactly. This allows the body to shift fully out of the sympathetic active state and initiate a true parasympathetic rest and digest reset overnight.
And the clinical outcome of this nightly reset is astonishing. The sources note that this specific parasympathetic dip translates to a nearly 20% lower risk of suffering major cardiovascular events, like heart attacks or strokes.
It is a profound example of a zero-cost intervention. You aren't buying a supplement. You aren't doing a complicated workout. You are dramatically altering your systemic cardiovascular health simply by working in harmony with the body's natural circadian rhythms instead of forcing it to digest while it's trying to repair.
But what happens when that systemic harmony is completely overwhelmed? We've talked extensively about optimizing diet and dialing in exercise. But the story of Wade Lightheart perfectly illustrates that you can have the physical mechanics seemingly perfect and still experience a catastrophic systemic biological failure.
Lightheart's experience is a visceral warning about the sheer physiological power of the stress response and how it can override even the most disciplined physical routines.
To bring us back to the hook of this entire deep dive, Lightheart had just finished competing in a Mr. Universe bodybuilding competition. He was at the absolute peak of visible outward physical condition. But in the 11 weeks immediately following that competition, his body spiraled out of control. He gained 42 pounds of fat and water in under 3 months.
And it is crucial to understand that this wasn't because he suddenly lost his mind and forgot how to eat or how to train. It was because the intense, unmitigated physical and psychological stress of that extreme competition preparation had completely disrupted his internal ecosystem. Specifically, the prolonged stress response actively shut down his body's ability to produce digestive enzymes.
Wait, so he was putting healthy food into his mouth, but his internal machinery literally couldn't process it.
That is the biological reality of stress. When your body is locked in a state of chronic sympathetic nervous system dominance, the classic fight or flight mode, it triages its resources. It shunts blood and energy away from non-essential survival functions, and digestion is the first thing to get downregulated. If you are running from a tiger, your body does not care about absorbing the nutrients from your last meal. But if that stress becomes chronic and unmitigated, your gut function fundamentally plummets.
The entire assembly line grinds to a halt.
Yes. The microbiome suffers, the pancreas stops secreting adequate digestive enzymes, and the stomach acid profile changes. Because the food is no longer being broken down properly, it ferments and putrefies in the gut. The body enters a state of massive systemic inflammation. It retains immense amounts of water to dilute the inflammatory cytokines, and it rapidly stores fat as a protective mechanism.
Which perfectly explains his rapid 42-pound weight gain. So how do you fix a failure that deep? Because he obviously couldn't just, diet or cardio his way out of a fundamentally broken digestive system.
No, he had to step back and rebuild the entire ecosystem from the mucosal layer up. He completely shifted his approach, moving to a raw food diet for 2 full years to minimize the digestive burden, and he heavily utilized exogenous supplemental enzymes to repair his digestive tract from the inside out. He had to proactively do the chemical work for his gut while his nervous system recovered from the chronic stress.
This concept of proactively building a resilient microbiome is something Dr. Mark Hyman echoes in the sources. He emphasizes that we need to slowly, systematically increase varied plant fiber intake to actually feed the beneficial gut bacteria. And there's this anecdote he shares that is equal parts humorous and genuinely terrifying about our modern baseline of health. He talks about a patient who came into his clinic and legitimately thought that having a bowel movement once a week was perfectly normal and regular.
Yeah, that anecdote perfectly highlights how deeply disconnected modern society has become from its own physiological baselines. A healthy, robust microbiome, properly fueled by varied plant fibers and operating without the crushing weight of sympathetic stress, should be efficiently processing and eliminating waste daily.
When a system slows down to a once-a-week transit time, what is actually happening inside the body?
You are looking at a system that has fundamentally stalled. The waste material sits in the colon, and because the colon's primary job is to resorb water, it continues to pull fluid out of that waste. But it also begins to resorb the toxins, hormones, and metabolic byproducts that the liver had packaged up specifically to be eliminated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those toxins recirculate back into the bloodstream, driving further systemic inflammation, brain fog, and hormonal imbalances. It is a toxic feedback loop.
And this brings us to a crucial transition point. Wade Lightheart's pristine diet failed entirely because of a psychological and physical stress response. It perfectly illustrates the thesis of our deep dive. You can have the most dialed-in diet, the most perfectly optimized high-intensity interval routine, but if your mental and emotional state is a wreck, your physical body pays the ultimate systemic price.
The physical gut and the psychological mind are not separate compartments housed in the same body. They are the exact same continuous system communicating through the vagus nerve.
Which moves us beautifully into the chemistry of the mind and emotion. We've seen how muscle talks to the brain and how stress destroys the gut. Now we need to look at how specific nutrients and psychological mindsets directly alter our physiological hormones. Let's start with the chemistry. Dr. Tommy Wood brings up an incredible piece of research out of Oxford known as the VitaCog study, which focused on cognitive health and brain shrinkage.
The VitaCog study is a masterclass in why we must view human nutrition as an interconnected matrix, rather than just taking isolated supplements hoping for a magic bullet effect.
The researchers were looking at cognitive decline in older adults, and they found that lowering a specific amino acid called homocysteine by using B vitamin supplements did successfully slow cognitive decline. But there was a massive caveat. It only worked under one very specific biological condition. The individuals already had to have adequate levels of omega-3 fatty acids in their system.
And importantly, the reverse was also true in the data. Supplementing with high-quality omega-3s only provided a tangible cognitive benefit to the physical structures of the brains in subjects who already possess an adequate B vitamin status.
I think the best way to visualize this is like a construction site. Imagine your brain is a brick wall that's taking damage over time. The omega-3 fatty acids are the actual raw bricks needed to rebuild and repair the holes in the wall. But the B vitamins act as the skilled mason. And that homocysteine, that is toxic debris covering the worksite. You can dump all the raw bricks you want onto the site, taking handfuls of omega-3 supplements every morning. But if you don't have the B vitamin mason to clear away the homocysteine debris and actually lay the bricks, the wall stays broken.
That is a highly accurate mechanistic analogy. Homocysteine is a natural byproduct of metabolism, but at elevated levels, it acts as a neurotoxin. It is strongly associated with brain shrinkage, vascular damage, and accelerated cognitive decline. The B vitamins, specifically B6, B9, and B12, are the chemical catalysts required to methylate and recycle that toxic homocysteine back into harmless substances. They clear the worksite.
But clearing the site isn't enough to rebuild the wall.
Exactly. The brain then requires the physical structural building blocks, the omega-3 fatty acids like DHA and EPA, to actually synthesize new cell membranes and repair the neuronal architecture. If you chemically lower the homocysteine but lack the omega-3s, the brain has a clean site but no materials to rebuild. If you have the omega-3 materials but your homocysteine levels are raging because you lack B vitamins, the toxic damage simply outpaces the repair. The nutrients are biologically codependent.
That is fascinating. It's chemistry operating at a structural, physical level. But the sources then shift into chemistry at a psychological level, which might be even more profound. Let's look at Elia Crumb's research, which Dr. Tommy Wood also references, regarding the human physiological response to perceived challenges.
Dr. Crumb's research fundamentally forces us to reevaluate our cultural narratives surrounding stress.
The researchers utilized a specific protocol called the Trier Social Stress Test. The setup is diabolical. They bring subjects into a room and force them to deliver an entirely unprepared, complex speech to a panel of expert judges. And the panel is specifically instructed to be completely impassive. They don't smile, they don't nod encouragingly, they just stare in cold, judgmental silence.
From a clinical perspective, it is scientifically designed to be one of the most awkward, deeply stress-inducing scenarios a social primate like a human being can possibly endure. It triggers massive social anxiety.
Pure psychological agony. So they take the subjects and divide them into two groups. The first group is primed beforehand to believe the standard accepted narrative. Stress is harmful. Stress degrades your performance. Stress is bad for your heart. Try to suppress it and stay calm. But the second group is primed with a completely different psychological narrative. They are told the scientific truth that stress is enhancing. They are taught that the racing heart, the shallow breathing, and the sweaty palms are actually the body actively mobilizing energy to help them perform at their absolute peak cognitive capacity.
What's fascinating here is the measurable physical, chemical outcome of that simple psychological shift in perspective. When the researchers drew blood and measured the chemistry of the participants immediately after the speech, they found that both groups released the exact same massive flood of cortisol. The physical body recognized the severe stressor equally in both groups.
Wait, I want to isolate that mechanism because it defies everything we're taught. Both groups are sitting there, sweating, heart pounding. Their bodies are flooded with the exact same amount of the stress hormone cortisol. But the group that believed stress was enhancing actually performed better and recovered faster. How is that physically possible if the cortisol load is identical? There has to be a chemical buffer.
And there is. The group that was primed to believe stress is enhancing released significantly more of a counter-regulatory hormone called DHEA.
What exactly is DHEA doing in the brain during a stress response?
DHEA, or dehydroepiandrosterone, is a highly adaptive neurosteroid. While cortisol is catabolic and breaks things down to mobilize immediate energy, DHEA is anabolic. It promotes physical recovery, it enhances neurogenesis, and it literally helps the prefrontal cortex function better, allowing people to make clearer, more rational decisions while under intense pressure. It acts as a chemical buffer against the damaging effects of cortisol.
So by simply changing their conscious belief about the stress, they didn't magically eliminate the physical stress response their heart still pounded. But they physically, measurably altered the chemical cocktail their brain produced in response to it.
They changed the ratio of cortisol to DHEA. They turned a purely damaging catabolic event into an adaptive, neurologically enhancing one. The mind dictated the chemistry.
The mind dictates the chemistry. And this connects so deeply to the work of social scientist Dr. Arthur Brooks, highlighted in our sources, who studies how our very definition of happiness and achievement actually alters our physiological longevity. He talks about a psychological trap called the striver's curse.
The striver's curse is a phenomenon we see constantly in high-achieving type A individuals. These are highly ambitious people who spend their entire lives grinding toward massive, defining goals. But the tragedy is that when they finally cross that finish line, when they sell the startup, get the executive promotion, or win the prestigious award, they do not experience lasting joy. Instead, they frequently fall into a state of clinical depression.
Because the chemical satisfaction is so fleeting. It's dopamine-driven. You spend 10 years climbing the mountain, you get to the peak, you look around for 5 minutes, and then you just feel an overwhelming emptiness because there is no more mountain to climb. The dopamine crashes.
Precisely. The human brain's reward circuitry is evolutionarily wired to reward the pursuit of resources, not necessarily the baseline enjoyment of possessing them. If your entire psychological identity is tied to the next dopamine hit of achievement, you are caught on a hedonic treadmill. That constant striving keeps the sympathetic nervous system locked in a state of low-grade anxiety, which ultimately degrades your mental health and systemic resilience.
But Brooks doesn't just point out the psychological flaw. He offers a highly specific, actionable protocol to physically rewire that neural tendency. He recommends a personal practice of writing down exactly 5 things you are deeply grateful for every single Sunday. And then you must review that short list briefly every single night throughout the week.
It sounds like a cliché self-help platitude, but the clinical efficacy of this specific practice is profound.
He found that doing this consistently for just 10 weeks physically overrides our natural evolutionary human tendencies toward resentment, scanning for threats, and constant dissatisfaction. The data shows it raises a person's average baseline happiness by 12%, a 12% boost in baseline contentment just from a nightly review of 5 things.
Because you are utilizing neuroplasticity, you are actively forcing the brain to create new neural pathways that scan your environment for positive inputs, rather than allowing the default network to constantly scan for the next threat or the next unachieved goal. By training the neural pathways of contentment, you shift the brain away from dopamine-driven striving and toward serotonin and oxytocin-driven satisfaction. This lowers systemic inflammation and pulls the body out of that sympathetic nervous system overdrive.
And if we refuse to do this work, if we don't process these emotions, if we don't train those pathways, and instead we just aggressively suppress every negative feeling so we can keep grinding, the physical consequences can be debilitating. This mechanism is perfectly illustrated by the harrowing story of Dr. Sue Morter.
Her experience is a powerful, undeniable testament to the physical, biological weight of unresolved psychological energy.
Dr. Morter is an energy medicine doctor. She literally teaches this material. She knows all the theories. Yet she found herself suffering from these completely debilitating, blinding migraines that would keep her bedridden in a dark room for days at a time. No physical intervention, no diet change, no adjustment was fixing it.
Because the root cause of the vascular inflammation in her head wasn't purely physical in the traditional mechanistic sense. Through deep introspection, she realized she was living entirely up in her prefrontal cortex. She was constantly analyzing her life, managing her practice, and thinking her way through every problem. And in the process of being so hyper-intellectual, she was deeply suppressing unresolved, trapped emotional trauma in her body.
She was trying to think her way out of a feeling problem. She was trying to intellectualize a somatic issue.
And the body will always force the issue eventually. She eventually cured her chronic migraines by completely shifting her physical relationship to her emotions. She developed a somatic practice that she now heavily recommends to her patients. When you are triggered by a person or a stressful situation, the immediate default human habit is to start analyzing it intellectually. We immediately ask, why is this happening to me? Why did that person say that? How do I fix this scenario?
We spin a massive complex narrative in our heads, which just feeds the anxiety loop.
Right. But Dr. Morter argues we have to completely stop asking why and start asking where. You must shift your awareness from the analytical brain down into the interoceptive network of the body. Where do you physically feel the energetic charge of that emotional trigger right now? Is your gut suddenly clenched tight? Is there a heavy burning tightness in the center of your chest? Is your throat inexplicably constricted?
You locate the raw, physical sensation of the emotion. You find where it lives, and then what is the actual mechanism of processing it?
You focus your conscious attention entirely on that specific physical area. You refuse to engage with the narrative story of why it's happening, and you just breathe slowly up and down your central channel, your spine. You sit with the discomfort. By allowing that physical sensation to simply be felt without judgment, it eventually processes and passes through the nervous system. She argues that by doing this, you free up a massive amount of vital biological energy that was previously being wasted on muscular and nervous suppression. Your body can then redirect that freed up energy to actually heal physical ailments, which is exactly how she resolved the inflammation causing her migraines.
Dr. Morter's story is such a prime, undeniable example of systemic whole-body medicine. You simply cannot separate the physical vascular migraine from the trapped emotional stress. The matrix is entirely connected. And this brings us to the final critical piece of the puzzle in our longevity matrix, the cellular and hormonal maintenance that conventional medicine so often completely ignores because it has become so hyper-specialized.
When we talk about how the different parts of the systemic matrix communicate with each other, hormones are the ultimate biological messengers. And as we age, proactively maintaining those hormonal signals becomes the literal difference between thriving systemically and simply surviving a slow decline.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material dives deep into women's health and hormone replacement therapy, and it exposes some massive, tragic blind spots in standard medical care. Dr. Kelly Casperson shares this profound story about one of her patients that really highlights the flaw in the specialist model. This woman had developed superficial bladder cancer. She went through the grueling treatments, and the cancer was ultimately cured.
Which is a massive medical victory by any standard oncological definition. The specialists did their job perfectly.
The cancer was gone. But when asked about her medical journey, the patient stated that the cancer being cured wasn't what truly changed her life. What completely gave her life back was receiving a simple, generic prescription for vaginal estrogen.
That statement highlights a tragic gap in how modern medicine views true quality of life versus the simple absence of disease.
Why was the localized vaginal estrogen so revolutionary for this woman's daily existence?
Because for years prior to the cancer, this woman had been suffering from excruciatingly painful sex and relentless recurrent urinary tract infections. And for years, her primary care doctors were simply throwing endless rounds of oral antibiotics at the UTIs. They were treating them as isolated, random bacterial infections. But they weren't looking at the systemic, hormonal root cause, which was severe localized tissue atrophy due to a massive decline in estrogen.
So the physical tissue of her urogenital tract was literally degrading, thinning out, and losing its structural integrity because the hormonal signal telling it to stay robust had vanished.
Precisely. Estrogen is what keeps the mucosal tissues of the urogenital tract thick, elastic, and properly lubricated. Crucially, estrogen also maintains the local acidic pH that fosters a healthy microbiome, which naturally fends off bad bacteria like E. coli. When estrogen plummets during menopause, the tissue severely thins, exposing nerve endings, which causes the painful sex, and the pH shifts, leaving the bladder entirely vulnerable to constant infection. By finally prescribing a localized vaginal estrogen cream, Dr. Casperson didn't just mask a symptom with another antibiotic, she reversed the physical atrophy. She thickened the tissue, restored the microbiome, cured the painful sex, and stopped the recurrent UTIs at their absolute root source. The systemic day-to-day quality of life impact of replacing that localized hormone was, for this patient, more profoundly felt than surviving the cancer.
And the medical misunderstanding of hormones goes even deeper than localized treatments. Dr. Felice Gersh brings up another crucial point in the sources about hormone replacement, specifically regarding the systemic role of progesterone for women who lack a uterus.
This is perhaps the most glaring example of the hyper-specialized medical model fundamentally failing to grasp the systemic reality of the human body.
Dr. Gersh explains that the conventional medical advice, the standard protocol most doctors follow, is to intentionally withhold progesterone prescriptions from women who have undergone a hysterectomy. The flawed logic being, well, the primary role of progesterone is to protect the uterine lining from estrogen dominance. You don't have a uterus anymore, therefore you don't need the hormone. But she argues that this is a catastrophic misunderstanding of human physiology.
Because progesterone is absolutely not just a uterus hormone. It is a vital, systemic hormone with critical receptors located all over the entire biological matrix, especially concentrated in the brain and the cardiovascular system.
What are the specific systemic biological benefits that a woman is missing out on if her doctor just blindly withholds progesterone based on that outcoded logic?
Dr. Gersh points out several massive life-altering functions. First, from a cardiovascular standpoint, progesterone directly stimulates the endothelial cells to produce nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the crucial gas that keeps our blood vessels relaxed, dilated, and flexible. Without it, you lose vascular health and invite hypertension. Second, from a neurological standpoint, progesterone is actively required to protect and repair the myelin sheath on our nerves.
The myelin sheath, to use an analogy, that's the protective plastic coating on the outside of an electrical wire, right? It keeps the signal moving fast and prevents it from short-circuiting.
That is exactly what it is. When that biological insulation degrades, the electrical signals in the brain misfire, which is exactly what drives debilitating neurological conditions like multiple sclerosis. Progesterone helps maintain and repair that insulation. And third, progesterone converts into a neurosteroid called allopregnanolone, which has profound calming, GABA-enhancing effects on the brain. Because of this, adequate progesterone helps prevent the development of what Dr. Gersh refers to as senior seizures as women age and their brains become hyperexcitable.
I have to ask the obvious question. Why is conventional medicine getting this so fundamentally wrong? How can standard medical advice just completely ignore all of these massive systemic, neurological, and cardiovascular benefits?
Because modern medicine hyperspecializes to a fault. A gynecologist is highly trained to look at the uterus as an isolated organ, rather than part of an interconnected web. If the specific organ that the hormone is most famously associated with is surgically removed, the specialist assumes the hormone is no longer clinically necessary. They are entirely missing the systemic big picture of how that exact same hormone is simultaneously required to maintain the electrical wiring of the brain and the flexibility of the heart.
It brings us right back to the mechanic shop analogy from the very beginning. We are throwing away the oil because we think it's only good for making the radio work, completely ignoring the fact that it lubricates the entire engine block.
It is a profound failure of systems thinking.
And this idea of active, daily, systemic cellular maintenance extends beyond just optimizing our hormones. It applies to how we physically interact with our modern environment, which is constantly degrading our biology. Let's look at biohacker Dave Asprey's protocol for vision health, which wraps up our source material.
The eyes are a fascinating, highly exposed extension of the brain itself, and their daily metabolic energy demands are incredibly intense.
Asprey has developed this highly specific daily routine to combat age-related vision decline. Because the reality is that our modern habits are basically destroying our eyes faster than any previous generation. He recommends a daily practice he calls eye fasting.
This raises an important question about how our modern indoor environments are constantly fighting against our natural cellular biology. Human eyes did not evolve to spend 12 hours a day staring at glowing screens fixed exactly 2 feet from our faces.
We evolved to scan the horizon for predators. So his protocol starts with the physical mechanics. He advocates staring at true distance for 10 straight minutes every single day, looking out a window or going outside, and looking as far out to the horizon as you possibly can.
The mechanism there is pure physical muscular relaxation. Inside your eye, you have the ciliary body, which contains the muscles that constantly contract to change the shape of the lens so you can focus on a screen close up. When you stare at a phone all day, those ciliary muscles are locked in a state of chronic spasm. By staring at a true far distance, you are finally allowing those muscles to fully disengage and relax, releasing that chronic physical tension that alters the shape of the eye over time.
Once the muscles are relaxed, he follows that up with a specific mechanical blinking routine, doing 20 very fast, rapid blinks, immediately followed by 5 slow, incredibly tight squeezes of the eyelids. What is the biology behind the squeezing?
That is entirely about rebuilding the protective tear film. Your eyelids contain tiny meibomian glands that secrete the crucial lipid layer, the oils that keep the eye lubricated and prevent the tears from immediately evaporating. Staring at screens drastically reduces our natural blink rate, causing those glands to clog. The fast blinks, followed by the tight squeezes, physically milk those glands, forcing the lipids out to rebuild the tear film and protect the cornea from environmental oxidative stress.
And finally, he includes a highly targeted nutritional component just for the cellular health of the eyes, eating a handful of dark blueberries specifically to help regenerate a pigment called rhodopsin.
Rhodopsin is the incredibly sensitive, light-absorbing pigment located in the rods of the retina. Every time light hits your eye, rhodopsin is essentially bleached and destroyed to send the electrical signal to the brain. It is incredibly metabolically demanding for the body to constantly rebuild this pigment. The specific antioxidants found in blueberries, anthocyanins, provide the exact required chemical precursors the retina needs to rapidly regenerate that pigment and protects the delicate macular tissue from accumulated oxidative stress. It is highly targeted, specialized nutritional maintenance for a very vulnerable cellular function.
Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. From the sheer metabolic brain-protecting power of your quadriceps to the limitless wall-breaking fuel of fat oxidation, the gut-destroying power of unmitigated psychological stress, the structural codependence of B vitamins and omega-3s, all the way to localized vaginal hormones and the physical mechanics of eye fasting.
It is a vast, incredibly detailed matrix of information, but the underlying biological theme connecting all of it is perfectly, beautifully consistent.
To summarize this operating manual for you listening, vitality is absolutely not a single pill. It is not an isolated surgical intervention. It is an inextricably interconnected biological matrix where your quad strength physically dictates the gray matter in your brain, where your conscious psychological belief about an awkward speech literally changes the neurosteroids your brain secretes, where your unmanaged emotional state dictates whether your pancreas can even produce the enzymes to digest your food.
True. Lasting longevity, as proven by every single clinical source we examine today, comes from zooming out. You have to stop looking at the isolated, broken parts on the workbench and start honoring and actively maintaining the whole magnificent ecosystem.
So what does this all mean? I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder as you step back into the reality of your day. A thought that builds on everything we've unpacked. If every single system in our human body is this deeply chemically and structurally connected, where an omega-3 brick needs a B vitamin mason just to function, where your leg muscles determine your cognitive decline, and where withholding a systemic hormone because a single organ is missing causes the brain to misfire. What if the current specialist model of modern medicine is fundamentally incompatible with achieving true human longevity? We have built an entire medical infrastructure where you see a cardiologist for the heart, a neurologist for the brain, a gastroenterologist for the gut, and a psychiatrist for the mind. But are we trying to fix a complex, breathing, interconnected ecosystem by only ever looking at one tree at a time?
It is a profound paradigm-shifting question, and answering it shifts the ultimate responsibility for integrating and healing that ecosystem firmly back to the individual.
Remember the mechanic shop we talked about at the very beginning of this journey? Your body is not a machine made of isolated, replaceable parts. It is a living, breathing, beautifully interconnected web. Take this new operating manual out for a spin. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.